Under the scorching midday sun of Ouagadougou, the dusty red streets buzzed with car horns and rushing motorbikes. People hurried past, their faces tired and sweaty. But in one small corner, a man knelt beneath the hood of an old pickup truck, his body half hidden in the shadows of metal and grease. His hands were blackened with oil, his shirt patched and torn, sweat dripping steadily down his brow. His name was Thomas. To most passers-by, he was just another roadside mechanic, trading hours of heavy labor for a few coins and the occasional harsh word from an impatient customer. Yet few knew that years ago, Thomas had once been the brightest student in his class, a boy with a dream of becoming an engineer, a boy who believed he could help build a better Burkina Faso. But fate had dealt him a cruel hand. A fire had claimed his parents when he was only 16, and Thomas abandoned school to raise his younger sister. An elderly villager taught him how to repair engines, and in time he opened this small workshop on a dusty street corner. The work was hard, the pay uncertain. Yet through it all, Thomas never cheated a single customer. He often told himself, "If I stay honest and keep working, better days will come." What he didn't know was that fate was already moving, and on this very street corner, his life was about to change forever. That afternoon, as Thomas rested after a long day's work, his mind drifted back to the past. He remembered the small village of his childhood, where he and Ibrahim had been inseparable friends. They would sit together under the shade of a mango tree, sharing food, sharing dreams. Ibrahim often said, "One day, we'll change this country." And Thomas had believed him, with all his heart. The memories came rushing back. Two barefoot boys running through golden fields, their laughter echoing under the sun. He remembered the day they were caught stealing mangoes from an old farmer's orchard. Thomas had run so fast that his sandal flew into the river, but instead of saving himself, he turned back, grabbed Ibrahim's hand, and pulled him to safety. That childhood grip became a bond, convincing them both that they were destined to walk the same road together. But life had other plans. Ibrahim continued his studies, joined the military, and rose to become the leader of a nation. Thomas, after the tragedy of losing his parents, took a different path, a road of sweat, grease, and dust. Their journeys seemed to have diverged forever, yet deep inside, the promise remained. We will change this country together. A promise waiting for the day it would be awakened. That afternoon, the sun blazed mercilessly over Ouagadougou. At Thomas's tiny roadside workshop, the air was thick with the smell of fuel, the clatter of metal, and the sputter of old engines. Bent over a battered motorcycle, his calloused hands gripped a rusted bolt, sweat running down his face. To him, it was just another ordinary day. But the ordinary shattered when the sharp blare of horns and the shouts of bystanders filled the street. A line of sleek black cars pulled to a stop right at his dusty corner. Dark-suited bodyguards stepped out, their eyes scanning the crowd with cold precision. Whispers rippled through the people gathering. "It's the president's convoy. What's he doing here?" Thomas hardly looked up. Big cars and important men had nothing to do with the price of his work. His focus was on finishing the job, because customers paid the bills, not politicians. Then came a voice. Familiar, startling, like an echo from long ago. "Thomas?" He froze, wrench still in hand. Sweat dripped down his temples. Without raising his head, he muttered almost instinctively, "One moment, I'm almost done here." The crowd stirred. Then the voice rang out again, this time trembling with emotion. "Thomas, is it really you?" Slowly, Thomas straightened. He wiped his face with a rag streaked in grease and turned. His heart nearly stopped. Standing before him was a tall man in a crisp military uniform, epaulettes gleaming in the harsh sun. It was Ibrahim Traoré, the childhood friend who once stole mangoes with him, now the president of Burkina Faso. The street fell silent. All eyes watched as Ibrahim removed his cap, crossed the space in 3 long strides, and wrapped Thomas in a fierce embrace. Tears streamed down the face of the nation's leader as he whispered, "Thomas, my brother, I have searched for you for so many years." Gasps spread through the crowd. Cameras rose, phones clicked. The image was almost unbelievable. The president, weeping in public, holding a roadside mechanic in his arms. But Ibrahim didn't care. In that moment, the world around him disappeared. He saw only the boy who once held his hand as they ran through the fields of their youth. Thomas's rough hands gripped his shoulders. 20 years had passed, but Ibrahim's eyes were still the same, honest, unwavering, filled with brotherhood. On that dusty street beneath the blazing sun, two roads that had once diverged forever finally met again, in a reunion that left an entire city breathless. The crowd remained stunned at the sight before them. A president weeping openly, embracing a poor roadside mechanic in the middle of a dusty street. Phones were raised high, cameras clicking rapidly, capturing every second of this unbelievable moment. Ibrahim finally released Thomas, resting both hands firmly on his friend's shoulders. His eyes glistened with a mix of joy and sorrow. "You're still the same, Thomas. Still strong, still unyielding. I thought I had lost you forever." Thomas gave a faint smile, one tinged with both pride and quiet bitterness. He shook his head, wiping sweat away with a grease-stained rag. "I'm just a mechanic, Ibrahim. You're the president now, and I'm still here on this corner. We've walked two very different roads." Ibrahim's grip tightened, his voice breaking. "But the promise we made as boys, it still stands. Do you remember? We swore we would change this country together." Thomas looked down at his calloused hands, darkened with oil and scars from years of labor. His voice was steady, resolute. "I don't want money. I don't want titles. All I ask is that you keep that promise. Build a Burkina Faso where no child has to leave school the way I did. Make it a country where even the poorest can dream." The crowd fell silent. The roar of the city faded, and only Thomas's voice carried through the hot midday air. Ibrahim nodded, tears shimmering in his eyes but burning with conviction. "I promise, Thomas. On the honor of a soldier, on the honor of a president, I will begin today. Not because I am a leader, but because I was once that barefoot boy under the mango tree with you." In that moment, the people no longer saw just a president and a mechanic. They saw two men, bound not by power or wealth, but by friendship and a promise. The pride of leadership intertwined with the humility of brotherhood, creating a force greater than any speech could deliver. That evening, the convoy pulled away from the dusty street. People still gathered in clusters, whispering about what they had witnessed, while shaky phone videos spread rapidly across social media. But inside the armored car, President Ibrahim Traoré sat in silence, staring out the tinted window at the crimson sunset glowing over Ouagadougou. In his heart, a quiet storm was rising. He thought of Thomas, the childhood friend who once shared his dreams, now covered in grease and sweat at a roadside corner. He thought of the promise they had made long ago, a promise buried under years of duty and power, now resurrected like a bell tolling in his soul. When he returned to the presidential palace, Ibrahim did not head to his chambers as usual. Instead, he called an emergency meeting with his ministers late into the night. The grand hall glowed with harsh lights as officials shuffled in, surprised and uneasy. "Mr. President, what could be so urgent?" one of them whispered. Ibrahim stood before them, not with a scripted speech, not with polished rhetoric. He simply told them the story of Thomas, the mechanic who had refused money, refused privilege, and asked for only one thing: to keep a promise to the people, to give children the chance to stay in school. The room fell heavy with silence. An older minister nodded slowly, his eyes dim with shame. Another lowered his gaze, unable to meet Ibrahim's. For deep down, they all knew there were thousands of Thomas across Burkina Faso. Honest men and women working quietly, bearing the weight of the nation without recognition. Ibrahim's voice rang with conviction. "If I can ignore the suffering of my closest friend, then I can ignore the suffering of this entire people. And if I do that, this seat of power means nothing." No one spoke. In that moment, they weren't listening to a president. They were listening to a man, a son of the soil, reminding them that power fades, but a promise endures. That night, Ibrahim did not sleep. He sat at his desk, Maps of schools, hospitals, and job programs spread before him. With a red pen, he circled, marked, and scribbled notes furiously. The image of Thomas's oil-stained hands haunted him. They were no longer just his friends' hands. They symbolized millions of hands across Burkina Faso. And he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, I begin again, not as a politician, but as a friend who once promised to change this country." The next morning, the dusty corner where Thomas had spent years repairing broken cars suddenly became the center of attention. Crowds gathered, pressing close, eager to witness something no one could have imagined. A small stage had been set up beside his shabby roadside workshop. Security surrounded the area, microphones gleamed under the sun, and the national flag fluttered proudly in the wind. Television crews prepared their cameras. Thomas stood in the shadows of his old shop, his hands still stained with grease, confused by the commotion. Then, once again, the familiar convoy of black cars arrived. But this time, it wasn't a quiet, unexpected stop. It was official. President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out, his military uniform gleaming, his presence commanding, yet his eyes carried warmth. He walked straight to the stage and took the microphone. His voice rang clear across the square. "People of Burkina Faso, today I want to introduce to you an extraordinary man. He is not a politician, not a general, but a humble roadside mechanic. Yet he reminded me and all of us what true honesty and sacrifice mean." He gestured toward Thomas. The crowd fell silent, then erupted in cheers as the mechanic stepped out timidly. Thomas bowed his head, overwhelmed by thousands of eyes upon him. Ibrahim's voice softened with emotion. "This is Thomas, my childhood friend. When we were boys, he taught me mathematics. He shared food with me when I had none. He gave up his dreams to care for his sister and lived quietly in hardship. And yesterday, when I found him again, he asked me for nothing but one promise, that the children of this land would be given the chance to stay in school, to live better lives." Applause thundered like rolling drums. Many in the crowd wiped away tears. Then Ibrahim pointed to the old workshop beside them. "From today, this place will no longer be a tiny mechanic's shed. The government will turn it into a national training center where young people can learn skills, find jobs, and hold their heads high with pride." Thomas froze, unable to believe what he was hearing. Around him, cheers exploded. Young men and women in the crowd looked at one another with shining eyes, as if a new door to their future had just swung open. But Ibrahim wasn't finished. His gaze turned to where Thomas's wife Esther and little daughter Amina stood, trembling with emotion. He smiled warmly. "Amina, from this day forward, you will have a full scholarship. Any school you choose, from primary to university, even abroad. And Esther, you will become the owner of a modern supermarket provided by the government. You have stood by your husband, you have carried your family through hardship, and you deserve a life of dignity and happiness." Esther burst into tears, clutching her daughter tightly. Amina's eyes sparkled like stars as she cried out with joy. Thomas stood speechless, his own eyes brimming, unable to hold back the flood of emotion. He had never dreamed of riches or rewards, only to be remembered, to be seen. But now, he was more than remembered. He had become a symbol for an entire nation. As the crowd roared and chanted his name, Ibrahim stepped down from the stage, grasped Thomas's rough hand, and raised it high for all to see. And in that moment, the people of Burkina Faso understood a profound truth. No one is small when they live with honesty. And sometimes, a childhood promise is powerful enough to change the destiny of a nation. Only days after the grand ceremony, Thomas's name had spread across the nation. Newspapers called him the mechanic who restored the president's promise. Children in villages pretended to be mechanics instead of soldiers. Passers-by on the dusty street bowed their heads to him with newfound respect. But in the bright light of admiration, shadows began to creep in. One late afternoon, as Thomas was putting away his tools, two unfamiliar men entered his workshop. One was tall, wearing a dark suit and sunglasses that hid his eyes. The other was shorter, sharp in his movements, his gaze darting restlessly. They closed the door behind them. The shorter man placed a thick envelope on the table, his voice quiet but cutting. Inside is 5 million CFA. All you need to do is one small thing. Next time the president visits, make sure he drinks this. He set down a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid. Thomas frowned, staring first at the envelope, then at the vial. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. The taller man spoke, his tone calm but threatening. "It's not poison, just something to make him sick. Sick enough for others to step in. You'll be rewarded. Your own car shop, houses abroad, your daughter studying in Europe. All you need to do is agree." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. He knew this wasn't an offer, it was a warning. Refusal could put his family in danger. He sat in silence, his hands clenched, sweat trickling down his back. Then he replied with a steady voice. "Fine, come back in 2 days, I need time." The two men exchanged smug smiles before walking out. The moment the door shut, Thomas collapsed onto a chair, his heart pounding like a drum. He knew he stood at a crossroads between life and death. That night he told Esther everything. She gasped, tears spilling down her face. "My God, they want you to betray the president, the man who saved our family." Thomas shook his head firmly. "No, I will never do it. But I must be careful. If they suspect I'm warning him, they'll hurt us. Tonight I will go to Ibrahim. He must know the truth." He slipped the envelope and the vial into his bag. Evidence of a crime yet to unfold. His eyes hardened, steady despite the fear still coursing through him. Outside, the city roared with life. But inside that small home, Thomas and Esther knew a storm was coming, one darker, more dangerous than anything they had ever faced before. That night, Thomas put on his worn jacket, clutching the cloth bag that held the envelope and the small vial. He slipped quietly out of the house, while Esther stood at the doorway, her hands clasped tightly, eyes full of fear as if she could hold him back with just a look. The road to the presidential palace was quiet, bathed in the pale glow of street lamps. When Thomas arrived, the guard at the gate froze for a moment, then recognized him, the president's mechanic. Without a word, he led Thomas straight inside. In his office, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone, papers still scattered across his desk. The moment he saw Thomas, he rose, his face lighting up. "My brother, what brings you here at this hour?" Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he placed the envelope and vial firmly on the desk. His voice was low, steady. "Ibrahim, they wanted me to betray you. This is the proof." The room turned to stone. Ibrahim opened the envelope, thick stacks of cash spilling out. His hand touched the vial, eyes narrowing. For a brief moment, the calm president disappeared, replaced by a deep, simmering rage. "Who gave you this?" he demanded, his voice like thunder. Thomas recounted everything, the two men, their words, their promises, the cold stare behind the sunglasses. He left out nothing. Ibrahim stayed silent, then pressed a button. The head of security entered with a team of agents, their eyes sharp and unflinching. The president pointed to the evidence. "Trace it, find them, tonight." The team nodded and vanished. By dawn, the report came in. The two men had been captured at a hotel on the outskirts of the city. Dragged into the palace, they bowed their heads, drenched in sweat. Standing before Ibrahim, they stammered, We were just messengers. There are bigger men behind us. We were forced." Ibrahim slammed his fist onto the table. "Silence, there is no forcing. You chose betrayal, and betrayal has a price." Thomas sat beside him, fists clenched, staring straight at the men who had tried to drag his family into darkness. There was no fear left in his eyes, only anger, and the certainty that justice would be done. As the soldiers hauled the traitors away, Ibrahim placed a firm hand on Thomas's shoulder. His voice was heavy with emotion. "If you hadn't come to me tonight, tomorrow this country might have fallen into the wrong hands. You didn't just save me, Thomas. You saved an entire nation." Thomas lowered his head, his eyes glistening. "I only did what was right. We swore we would change this country together. I will not let anyone break that oath." Outside, the first rays of dawn broke through the windows, casting light over the two men, a president and a mechanic, standing side by side as equals, warriors who had just torn away the veil of betrayal. 3 days after the arrests, All of Burkina Faso buzzed with the news of the foiled plot against the president. Yet what the people spoke of most was not the traitors. It was the loyalty of a poor mechanic named Thomas. That morning, the central square of Ouagadougou overflowed with people. Thousands gathered, waving flags, holding banners, chanting. National television cameras lined the area. A special ceremony was about to take place, not to celebrate power, but to honor honesty and courage. On the stage, President Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward in his formal military uniform, his face stern but his eyes heavy with emotion. Beside him stood Thomas, dressed simply in a white shirt, his rough hands still bearing the marks of grease and labor. The ceremonial drums thundered. Ibrahim moved to the microphone, his voice ringing out across the vast crowd. People of Burkina Faso, 3 days ago I nearly became the victim of a dark conspiracy. But I stand here today, not because of guards, not because of power, but because of the loyalty of one man, my friend, my brother. He turned to Thomas, his gaze blazing with pride. This is Thomas, the mechanic who refused money, refused power, to protect me and to protect this nation. They offered him riches, but he chose justice. They promised him houses, but he chose the people. And because of that choice, today Burkina Faso still stands tall. The square erupted in cheers. Many wept openly, holding their phones high to capture the historic moment. Ibrahim's voice grew thick with emotion, yet stronger with conviction. Thomas is not just my friend. From this day forward, he is a national hero. The government will build training centers bearing his name so that the youth of this country may follow his example, live honestly, work diligently, and place loyalty above every temptation. Then, turning to Thomas, Ibrahim suddenly lifted his friend's arm high before the sea of people. The morning sun bathed them in golden light. Their two figures, one president, one mechanic, merged into one symbol. And the square thundered with a single name, chanted again and again. Thomas, Thomas, Thomas! In that moment, Thomas was no longer the poor man from a dusty street corner. He had become a living emblem of loyalty, etched forever into the history of Burkina Faso. Time passed, and the story of Thomas and President Ibrahim Traoré spread across Africa and beyond, appearing in major newspapers around the world. People called it the tale of friendship and loyalty that saved a nation. In Burkina Faso, real change began to take root. Vocational training centers bearing Thomas's name were built across the country. Thousands of young people, once on the verge of dropping out like Thomas long ago, now learned trades, found stable jobs, and stepped into brighter futures. In classrooms, teachers often told the story of the humble mechanic who saved the president and kept alive a childhood promise. Children listened with wide eyes, their hearts stirred by the belief that one day, they too could change their country with honesty and courage. For Thomas's family, life was still simple, but now filled with pride. Amina, the little girl who once clutched a worn teddy bear in the corner of a small home, now attended an international school on a full scholarship. Whenever classmates asked, she would smile and say, "My father is a mechanic, but he taught me that loyalty is worth more than gold." Esther, the wife who had stood by her husband through hardship, now managed the supermarket that bore her name. But she never boasted. To her, the greatest reward was not wealth or status, but knowing that her husband had become a living example for an entire nation. And Thomas himself, though celebrated as a national hero, remained humble. He often said, "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I only did what any friend should do. It was Ibrahim who kept the promise we made together." One evening, inside the presidential office, Ibrahim stood quietly before an old photograph, a picture of two schoolboys in faded uniforms, one with his arm slung over the other, both smiling with innocent joy. He whispered with a gentle smile, "We kept our promise, Thomas. In the end, we truly did. From what once seemed like a forgotten vow of childhood, a new legacy was written, not of power or ambition, but of honesty, loyalty, and friendship that time could not erase." Today, when people speak of Burkina Faso, they don't just recall its struggles. They remember the story of a president and a mechanic, a story that stands as proof that sometimes a childhood promise is enough to change the world.